I think of all the men that played, that took the knocks and made the grade, the legends that the game has made. I can't believe I'm here.
5 minutes to go about before 0 hour, and the crowd, I would say, around the 40,000 mark. And quite a moment for the 6 new caps waiting there in the dressing room underneath that fast stand opposite. Here come the team. Sorry, Bledin.
Of the millions who dream, it falls to very few men to represent Australia in Wallaby gold. This is the story of the 5th Wallabies, the 31 men who represented Australia on the Grand Tour of the British Isles, France and Canada in 1966 and 67.
I have a number on my back. I am a
In Rugby Union's amateur heyday, Australian teams went to Europe only once a decade, and it was a grand tour like no other. In 1966, the 5th squad of Wallabies set out for this tour of tours. Led by the legendary John Thornett and Ken Catchpole, they were paid $1 a day to tour the world together for nearly 5 months.
Overall, as an encompassing thing, it was just what a wonderful experience it was. $1 a day stuff. But you know, some people would say $1 a day and we're probably overpaid.
We were treated like rock stars, you know, and to be able to play rugby every couple of days and move to a different town, stay in a wonderful hotel, meet all these people, just, you know, like how lucky could we be?
In those days there was a sense of warmth, certainly a sense of welcoming. We weren't going to see Australia for another 10 years probably. And it has to be said, this Australian team, as I recollect it, had a great reputation for wonderful rugby, eye-catching rugby, attacking rugby.
These people inspired generations to come. I mean, Catchpole is still spoken in reverential terms. Jimmy Lenihan, goodness me, an inspirational athlete. Brass, Hawthorn, Rob Hemming, these were amongst the finest players the game has ever produced. I certainly would have loved to have coached some of those blokes, I can tell you.
I have a number on my back. I am a Wallaby.
Now, of course, every team that plays is the Wallabies. You're talking about the 5th Wallabies. Now, that's a very significant term, because the Wallaby name in history should only relate to touring sides. Now, there is a significance in saying the 5th Wallabies. It was the 5th such team to tour. And that itinerary in 66, 67, you went the length and breadth of England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales, and you were there to be educated, you were there to see the world, you were there to make friends. That was the virtue of our game, but you see it was amateur, in the real sense of the word.
I first played rugby at Coogee Preparatory School at around 10 years of age. While at Scots College, I became a junior referee at 15 years of age, and as my brother Bob played with Randwick, I followed.
My name's Peter Criddle. I'm a Wallaby. I started playing when I was 7 years of age until I was nearly 40. I then went into administration. I became president of the Australian Rugby Union.
I'm John O'Gorman. I first started playing rugby in 6th class at school. From there I went to St Joseph's College in Sydney. I'd only played on the wing. A famous coach called Brother Henry, as soon as he saw me play one game, he said, "Son, you're not a winger, you're a number 8. I owe a lot to him, because if I'd played in the wing I wouldn't have made any representations at all.
I'm Peter Ryan, born in Cooma, New South Wales. My ambition was to be a Wallaby, always was. You can achieve those ambitions in sport if you look after yourself and do the right thing.
My name is Alan Cardy. As I said, my parents were very poor. I was the captain at Katoomba High School. I got a scholarship I was doing a phys ed course. My goal was to get a green tracksuit with Australia written on its back.
I was first introduced to rugby union after a schoolboy career in rugby league in the mid-north coast. And as a number of my classmates were playing rugby with Randwick, I decided to join them. There was no money in this game, and where there's no money involved, the only ulterior motive is for the friendship that it engenders.
John Francis scoring under the post.
G'day, my name's Stuart Boyce. I first became a Wallaby in 1962. This was the amateur era. We'd only got paid $1 a day, but the opportunity was priceless.
Stuart Boyce has scored a fine try for Australia. He's 24 years of age, a medical student at Sydney University who's played for Australia, first captain 1962.
I was of a similar age group to the guys in the 66-67 team, so I got to know them fairly well, and people nowadays wouldn't quite understand how far away Europe really was. It was almost incomprehensible to think that someone could take 5 months out of their lives, out of their education or their wage-earning life to go away to play rugby. Their total livelihood disappeared for the best part of half a year. As youngsters growing up, we didn't think it was such a hardship. We were just enthralled with the fact that such an adventure was possible. And in the old days, of course, they went by boat.
Wales always looked forward, as did the rest of the country, for a touring team. Unlike today, where you play your solitary international and move away, in those days the tour would last something like 3 months and over, and would cover the period of the Christmas time. And there was always a sense of expectation, because of the rarity more than anything, and to have visitors come over here. Unlike today, the individual nations of the 4 nations, Ireland, Scotland, England, were never travelled. It was only the Lions that travelled away. So there was always a welcome when Australia, New Zealand or South Africa came here. It was a great event.
As a Wallaby, you're honouring a very proud tradition that we've built up over the years behind us. I heard it everywhere we went. The locals had a very positive affection for the Wallabies. The way they played the game, it was entertaining, and off the field after the game and in between the games, we're all socially equal. That's not always the same in some of the countries we played in, and I think they could see that in the British Isles and in South Africa, because in South Africa they had huge problems in that area with apartheid when we were there, but the British Isles was a great example of the Australian way of life versus the old European way.
Australian rugby sides have been touring to the British Isles for over 100 years, preaching the running game to the Northern Hemisphere and lapping up the diverse hospitality of the rugby-speaking world. It all began in 1908, when an Australian team captained by Herbert Paddy Moran arrived in the UK and decided to call themselves the Wallabies. These first Wallabies defeated England, lost to Wales, won the Olympic gold medal for rugby, and gave birth to one of the greatest traditions in world sport. Because Queensland rugby closed down for a decade after World War I, the second team from Australia to take the Grand Tour was actually a New South Wales side, the famous 1927-28 Waratahs, who won hearts with their running rugby flair. Way down the line in the 1980s, that team would actually be accorded Test match status. But the team still known as the Second Wallabies arrived in England on the fateful date of 2nd of September 1939. Hitler had invaded Poland the day before, and the tour was cancelled.
But they arrived over there, instead of playing games, they were filling sandbags for the war effort.
The third Wallabies toured in 1947-48, losing to France and again to Wales, but beating Ireland, Scotland and England in style. The fourth Wallabies toured in 57-58, but lost all 5 of their Test matches. Fifth Wallaby Jim Lenihan was with the fourth Wallabies, aged just 19.
Well, we had a great team and a lot of us played for a long time, and the first tour we went over by ship from Sydney through the Suez Canal and all that sort of stuff, and we used to train on the boat every day. We were away for about 9 months. We went to Buckingham Palace and all very enjoyable and a lovely look around the British Isles.
Also touring with the 4th Wallabies was a young John Thornett, who had debuted in 1955 and would lead the 5th Wallaby tour in 66-67. Sports writer Jim Webster, who accompanied the 5th Wallaby tour, has written about rugby for over half a century and remains impressed by Thornett's leadership qualities.
A wonderful person, came from a great sporting family as such, and I don't know if I've ever encountered a captain who demanded more respect than Thorne did. Even in retirement, the players still looked on Thorne as their leader, to this day.
I was privileged to represent Australia during the 50s and 60s, when international rugby was far different from what it is today. Rugby tours of those days ranked, I believe, as the ultimate in sporting experience.
For Thornett, rugby tours were the ultimate sporting experience. And for those who toured with him, like 5th Wallaby and former president of the ARU, Peter Crittall, Thornett remains the ultimate sporting captain.
Probably the most outstanding leader Australia's had, in my opinion. He led by example. He was a great advertisement for Australia off the field as well. A very erudite speaker, captured the imagination of the British sporting public, and was a great ambassador for the code in Australia.
When John Thornett and his men were arriving on the international scene in the 50s and early 60s, success was but a dim memory for Australian rugby. Australia had played 36 test matches against major rugby nations between 1950 and 63, but had won only 4.
Chance for Australia. Connor is over. No.
We'd been a bit down on top-class international standards in the 50s and early 60s, but as the 60s started to get underway, we'd really started to pick up because some absolutely world-class players either started to appear or started to grow into their peak of their careers.
Horrocks Taylor kicks off for England at the Sydney Sports Ground.
When the 1960s opened, Aussie rugby had been in a rut. Crowds had dwindled and big wins were rare. But all that was about to change. Captaincy of the Wallabies passed to John Thornett in 1962. Australia had had to wait 29 years to defeat a major rugby nation on Australian soil. But in 1963, the drought finally broke. On a rain-sodden pitch in Sydney, Thornett's men beat England by 18 points to 9.
On the blind side. Boyce coming through fast. He's down, only Washington at the fullback in front. Inside the 25. 5 yards out, here's a great chance. The man's over the line, Heinrich the scorer. Try by breakaway Heinrich.
Later in 1963, the touring Wallabies inflicted consecutive defeats on the mighty Springboks in South Africa, a feat not achieved by any side since 1896. Thornett's Wallabies played some of their finest rugby on this 3-month tour, and the bonds that developed between players on this African safari would hold Australian rugby in good stead for the years and even decades to come. 5th Wallaby Jim Miller explains.
We'd all been around each other together sort of from the early 60s. We just developed a very, very great harmony amongst the whole team. Now, John Thornett was an outstanding person and an outstanding leader, but he wasn't a dictatorial leader. It was a team that had a lot of conciliation. We all contributed to the tour fund. You see, we weren't paid, but we got issues of tickets, so we all had to do our turn in selling tickets outside the ground or flogging something. So we weren't spoilt by affluence or media presence. We were just playing the game we loved. We were getting free booze and free everything else, and we were young, and it was about as good as you can get. Those tours were 4 months and 3 months, and you were living with each other for that long. You learn all the songs, you carry on. We lived a wonderful life.
Oh, my sorry Mary, so fair from my heart.
Also singing along on the 63 Africa tour was fifth Wallaby and undiscovered troubadour of world rugby, Jules Gerasimov.
Something like that.
All the singing must have helped.
Australia-New Zealand program 1964 at Wellington, where we gave them a nice old hiding.
When the Box toured in 1965, Australia secured its first ever series win over South Africa and the first series win over a major nation by Australia at home since 1934.
Catchpole to Hawthorn. There's the full-time siren, the ball in touch, and Australia has won the second test match and the series.
Thornett once explained the success of Aussie rugby in his era by writing that we were blessed with the world's best players in key positions, naming Ken Catchpole at halfback, Rob Hemming in lineouts, Peter Johnson at hooker, and Greg Davis and Jules Gerasimov at breakaway. All five of these men toured with the fifth Wallabies in 66-7. Jules Gerasimov.
Well, I was the only, I think I'm the only Russian descended guy that's ever played for Australia. Grandfather actually served in the Tsar's army. But then when communism started to appear, they were told to sort of, bolt. They went across to Siberia, Japan, and then across to Canada, and then went to Manchuria. Got a ticket somehow to Australia, arrived in a little town called Thangool in central Queensland. And I was born 10 days after they arrived there. I was almost a Chinaman.
Jules was a very tough rooster, very, very talented, strong, aggressive, and he was one of the best back rowers that I encountered. And we had a very good back row, probably highlighted by Gregory Victor Davis.
Unbelievably brilliant. He was the captain of my club side, Tremoyne.
He was renowned for his very aggressive tackling on opposition inside backs and his non-stop chase of the ball.
We had probably the world's best line-out jumper at that time in Rob Hemming.
Well, I was born in New Guinea, or New Ireland in fact, and when the Japanese came in, they evacuated the women and children out of New Guinea. We were on the last boat as the Japanese were coming in, and my father was left up there and was killed by the Japanese. My mother arrived in Sydney with hardly any money, and we survived. But paradise we survived in Manly.
I always say that I remember Rob training at Manly Oval, where he used to jump up and he could clap his hands above the crossbar. I've never seen any forward before or since with the ability to do that.
There are many stories about Rob's ability in South Africa and the clean ball that he would take with two hands. No tap backs, which made it difficult for the halfback, but two hands, clean ball. And in those days, of course, there's no lifting. It was all strength and endurance. And of course, that then set up the platform for Catchy to work with all these outer backs with a long, crisp passing.
And so there wasn't only Catchy in that team. Certainly, Thorns talked about Peter Johnson, who was one of the truly great hooker forwards.
Peter Johnson, a wonderful man, a most dedicated footballer. He was surpassed in his role as a hooker. In fact, so much so, the Catchpole Johnson era was so great that referees couldn't believe that they weren't cheating. They were so quick at getting the ball into the scrum and out again. But that wasn't without hours and hours of practice that Catchpole and Johnson wouldn't do together against the fence, just finessing their skills. It didn't come easy for them, but they were ardent supporters of practice makes perfect.
Australia have it, a good heel. This is Hawthorn trying a drop, and it's over.
I thought that our two props, John Thornett and John White, were worthy of a mention as well, and were absolute world-class players, and I actually think that Phil Hawthorn was probably worthy of a mention.
A fine drop goal by this quicksilver and brilliant out-half, Phil Hawthorn.
Phil Hawthorn used to say to me, the number of times that I'd played with Catchy, I'd never bother to look where he was. I'd just stand there with my hands out, and he said that ball would hit my hands seconds after it had come out of a scrum or a ruck or a maul or what have you. And to this day, I still say that Catchpole is the greatest rugby player I have ever seen. He was that good.
We had great players, and from time to time I would talk to them about the team that started to come into prominence, for me at least, in '63, probably, when they went to South Africa and drew the Test series in South Africa, and no Wallaby team had ever done that, and they put together a very, very good forward pack that could hold their own with the Springboks, who were the masters of forward play. And all of the Wallaby forwards of that era would say to me, no, forget about our forward pack, we had Catchy. It was just something else. He was so much better than everyone else. It was almost that he was playing on another level. Two of the senior administrators of my club, Wally Ma and Cyril Towers, who had been members of the 27-28 Waratahs. Wally asked Cyril to come and watch Scots College play a pre-season trial match. He said, there's a very special player there, plays scrum half, his name's Ken Catchpole. I think that one day he may be the greatest scrum half the world's ever seen. And that was in 1957. And then 1958, Catchy played his first year with the club in Colts. And the next year, 1959, he went straight from Colts into first grade and then straight into the Waratahs against the British Lions.
After impressing for the Waratahs in 1959, Catchpole was selected for Australia in '61 and promptly dispatched for the short tour of South Africa as both captain and coach of the Wallabies. He was just 21 years of age. Fifth Wallaby Rob Hemming was there.
I think he played brilliantly. He did the job. I mean, he's the most impressive footballer I've ever played with. Simply the greatest, I think. That's all I can say about Ken.
In 2017, Catchy was living in Sydney with artist wife June. His teammates remember him still as the greatest player ever. But for the great man himself, such memories have been lost in the fog of Alzheimer's disease.
My international career started in 1959 when I represented for New South Wales against the British Lions. I've made tours to the British Isles, New Zealand twice and South Africa twice. I played in 27 test matches and captained Australia 13 times. Wow!
Fifth Wallaby Dick Marks, who later served 2 decades as Australia's national coaching director, remembers the astonishing pace of Catchpole's game.
At halfback, he was like the computer. Speed of thinking and speed of doing things, reflexes. You could never go for people outside him because if you did that, he'd be through like a shot.
Catchpole, the open side, looking for the gap, he's through the gap. Little Catchpole flying, he'll score himself. What a wonderful try, Ken Catchpole. The fellow's a genius.
And his cover defence was absolutely outstanding. You'd think that a try was definitely on, and suddenly, from nowhere, he would just appear.
From this line out, South Africa makes its best movement of the match. 5'8" Riley makes the half opening. A high pass to Salia on the wing. Catchpole comes from nowhere and saves a certain try.
Fifth Wallaby John Brass, who later captained Australia in Rugby League, was another early Catchpole fan.
I first saw Ken play against the British Lions in 1959 at the Sydney Sports Ground, and I think he was 19 at the time. And I was just mesmerised by the ability that Ken had, and somehow deep inside me I wanted to play a game with him at one stage, and thinking what an honour that would be to play with the great Ken Catchpole, and eventually got to do that, which was one of the most satisfying early parts of my rugby career. And I think one of the great memories from playing outside Ken in the early days was, as a young kid, he looked at me in the eye and he said, "Jimmy, do you want the ball lace up or lace down? In other words, you don't want to catch it with the lace up there or down here." And to this day, I still don't know whether he was serious or not, but he sort of had the ability that he could play to that level.
Helped by the talented players at its core, the Thornett era had brought Australian rugby back as a serious force. A decade after the Fourth Wallabies had failed to win a test, prospects for success on the Fifth Wallaby Tour were looking up. A visit by Campbell Lamerton's British Lions in 1966 offered Aussie players a chance to vie for selection on the coveted Northern Tour.
Good afternoon to you. It's a perfect day in Sydney for the clash between the British Isles and Australia. It's 7 years since these two teams met in Australia, and on the last occasion, the British Isles won both matches, winning 17-6 in Brisbane and 24-3 in Sydney.
Sprint champion Alan Cardy, aged 20 and playing only his first season of rugby union, played on the wing for Australia.
I think the first test was at the Sydney Cricket Ground. It was a fairly close game. I think there was a record crowd there to watch us, but we got beaten. The second test was in Brisbane, and we had some injuries, and we got absolutely thrashed.
What a glorious try that was. At the age of 19, the famous test match, well, infamous I guess, but where we got beaten 31-0, so my test career at that stage didn't read too well. And I wasn't all that confident of that it would go any further. That John Thornett got us behind the line when I think they were leading 21-0 or something, and said, exactly, come on fellas, this is not us.
He said, chaps, this is simply not us. And I said, well, thank God for that. Let's get out of here before someone recognises us.
And the second test match is over. British Isles 31 points, Australia 0.
It was the lead up to making selection trials to go to England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales and France. They had two trials, like possibles and probables, and from that they selected the team.
I knew it was going to be picked at 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, and when you're never certain you're going to be in the team, you sort of tend to hide a bit.
I myself was sitting by myself in a car on the edge of the ocean when my name was called. I of course lived away from home, and of course I had no idea of football. And when I explained that I'd been selected in the Wallabies, the old gentleman said, "Is that good?" I had to assure him that it was quite good.
I don't think there were too many surprises in the selection. People from each state, Victoria, Queensland and New South Wales. Players like Rob Hemming, Ross Teitzel, Greg Davis, Jules Gerasimov, and naturally Ken Catchpole and Phil Hawthorne. Guys like Johnny Brass and Phil Smith and myself, we were all almost wet behind the ears.
Well, you know, we're talking about John Brass. I mean, heavens above. Did Australian rugby produce a better centre than John Brass? Alan Cardy, magnificent athlete. Cardy, looking at Tony Miller, Roy Prosser, Hawthorne, Hipple in this team. Hipple, one of the legends of the game. And Dick Marks, Mick Purcell, Ross Teitzel. Teitzel, there was no second rower better than Teitzel. I mean, these were Queenslanders. John O'Gorman. These were super players. Stuart Boyce as a winger. Goodness me. It was a very gifted side, that side. They had good players everywhere.
Captaincy of the side again went to John Thornett, with Catchpole as vice-captain. The manager was Bill McLaughlin. McLaughlin was a former Wallaby who'd played against New Zealand in 1936 and later served in World War II as an officer in an anti-aircraft gun crew, as Rob Hemming recalls.
Bill McLaughlin, the toughest old guy you could ever find. In Darwin, when the Japanese flew over, he got the guns out, got the men out and started firing back at the Japanese. That was Bill. Brave and tough.
Coaching responsibilities fell to Alan Roper, the assistant manager. Roper had made his name in rugby at Manly and also in Forces Rugby during the war, while serving in the Air Force. He became coach of Australia in 1962.
Alan Roper, very impressive. He's a bomber pilot, many flights into Germany. Just amazingly brave, tough. To coach Manly, coach various teams. Terrific old guy he was, actually. Liked the grog a bit, but didn't we all?
McLaughlin and Roper had built a formidable reputation managing the 1963 South Africa tour, and hopes were high of repeating the magic.
When I think of all the men that played, that took the knocks and made the grade, the legends that the game has made, I can't believe I'm here.
The Ross Cullen episode, I think, is one of the most disgraceful episodes in the history of Australian rugby.
For the first time, Wales had lost to Australia. We were, of course, thoroughly disappointed.
And in London that night, the strains of Waltzing Matilda could be heard around Piccadilly Circus as Australia supporters celebrate.
In the late 60s, we became very poor at rugby, and that was highlighted by getting beaten by Tonga in 1973.
A few people got together and said, well, we have to do something serious about this. So out of that era, out of that team and out of that subsequent era of administrators and coaches and coach educators, Australian rugby really developed into the #1 team in the world.
Reunions were traditionally organised by the senior members. People ask, well, why are you having a Gunda guide?
It takes no time for them to go back 50 years. I've seen walking sticks and canes thrown away on this particular reunion.
For the future, you draw on the wisdom of the past. The great players of the past showed us what level of performance was possible. And we need to remember that and insist upon that and indeed demand that. Because if it was possible in the past, it's possible again in the future.
Us champions don't always win, they're known for coming back again, and we will make